Hello everybody, how are you doing? So today I'm going to talk about Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck won the Nobel Prize later on in his life after he'd written most of his novels, and Grapes of Wrath was brought up extensively during the presentation of that award, and it's considered his best novel and one of the best American novels of all time. And I've read Steinbeck's three most famous works as listed on the Jordan Peterson reading list. And I tend to agree. This is his best in a technical sense. It's not my favorite. East of Eden is my favorite. But as far as just a crafted work of art, this is his very best, and it's almost like he's sculpted this novel, and it's fantastically done. It's powerful, it's heart-wrenching, and well worth a read. Most people encounter it in high school, as did I. And most high schoolers don't like it. And I didn't really like it. I was kind of ambivalent about it. I skimmed through it, didn't really take the time to sit down and really read it as I did with a lot of the books in high school. And this project that I'm endeavoring on is kind of a attempt to amend that part of my past and to actually read books. And I remember reading one of the top-rated reviews on Goodreads for Grapes of Wrath, and the guy said this book is wasted on high schoolers. And he said, I'm sorry that a lot of people are subjected to this book as high schoolers because they're not mature enough, by and large, to understand it and connect with the themes and empathize with these characters' desire for just dignity, basically, through work, that it turns a lot of people off this book. And unless you are able to encounter it later in life, like in your 20s or later, you kind of are like, oh yeah, I hated that book. I had to read it in high school. I hated it. But yeah, I read this past year. I was 27, and I think I somewhat agree with that. It's a book for people who have lived life a little bit and had some life experiences, had some experience having to take care of themselves and worry about providing for themselves and for their family. And high schoolers obviously are all across the board on their home circumstances and stuff like that. A lot of my high schoolers end up having to take on a lot more mature roles in the household than they're ready for, which is sad. But it's a book written for people that can understand what these characters are going through. And I think that just takes time and maturity. But anyway, that's what I'll say about that. Because most people contact this book in high school, so just wanted to address that. So what happens in this book? It's set during the Great Depression, and the main characters are this family, the Joads, and they're from Oklahoma. And they're farmers in Oklahoma, and the Great Dust Bowl of I forget what year happens, and their crops are destroyed. And this is the case for a lot of Okies, and so there's nothing to do. There's no way for them to continue surviving in Oklahoma, and so a lot of pamphlets are going around advertising that there is work in California, picking fruit and stuff like that. And so the book starts with Tom Joad. He's one of the sons of the Joad family, and he is fresh out of a 4-year sentence in prison for murder, which he murdered a guy in self-defense. And he's very kind of a stoic character, very kind of zen, maybe just laid back. His philosophy is, he doesn't regret killing the guy. He said, I'd do it again because I wasn't wrong. He came at me with a knife, and I did what I had to do, and then I paid the price for it. But if I didn't, he would have killed me. And he kind of has this very he's very calm. He's very sure of himself in a sense. And he's kind of emerged with this philosophy of, I'm going to live in the moment and see what life brings me, and I'm going to focus on the here and now. And the book starts with him walking back to his family farm from prison. And he meets up with an old friend who used to be a traveling evangelist named Jim Casey, who's one of the most intriguing characters in my opinion. And Jim is no longer a preacher, and him and Tom have this very interesting conversation about how he lost his traditional faith. He's a very interesting character because he's kind of a Christ figure in this book. He represents sort of a Messiah. He's a leader. He's very compassionate towards other people, other characters. But he has lost his faith in his religion, what he's been preaching. And he talks to Tom Joad about this, and he said, I realized eventually that I knew a bunch of stories, but I didn't know God. And that's sad for me as a Christian, but I could understand where he was coming from, but also I think he was my favorite character because he was the most like Christ in this book, even though he's, a lot of Christians probably during that time would look down on him. And it's not just that he was this tortured soul who kind of lost his faith, but he was, he was a sinner. He said he would, at these tent meetings, revival meetings that he would put on, he would get these women so worked up in the Holy Spirit, and then he'd take them out in the grass. And he kept doing that, and surrendering to the temptations of the flesh, which tells you a lot about I've talked a little bit about some of my reservations of charismatic Christianity, but or maybe that was in a different video and I didn't publish that. But and he recognizes that was bad, but he also thought, no, well, it was kind of a natural human desire. And so that was one thing that led him away from the faith. And anyway, so him and Tom end up going back and meeting up with their parents that are referred to as Ma Joad and Pa Joad. Also really, really well-written, fleshed-out characters. He has a sister named Rose of Sharon who's newly pregnant, and her husband Connie. And there's the grandma and Grandpa Joad. And there's Noah Joad, who's his older brother. And there's a few more characters, I think. And anyway, they end up packing up in this horse-drawn sort of... No, they're in a car. I'm sorry. But it's a big sort of wagon. And they make the trip all the way to California. And this is a long book, and it just it takes its time. And so their travel is a good chunk of the book, getting to California. And then when they get to California, that's like only halfway through the book. And this it's devastating because when they get there, there's no work. The work everybody they figure out on the road all of these other Okies are going to California, and so California is just overstuffed with all these migrant workers. They get to they get to jack down the wages, and so they're working for pennies. Most of them can't find work. They congregate in these migrant worker settlements, which are constantly under the threat of being raided by the police. And they're just sort of these camps, almost like refugee camps, where all these people from out of town have come to seek work. And they go out every day and try and find a plantation or an orchard that will hire them for the day, if they're lucky, to pick fruit. And they pay them pennies, and then they have to come back to the camp late at night and spend that money on not enough food to feed their family dinner. And it's not just the Joads that suffer, it's everybody. And so they're sort of this microcosm of the suffering worker, and they get plugged into this larger community of poor people that are being exploited. And when this book came out, it was a lot of critics said this is socialist propaganda. And Jordan Peterson has talked a lot about propaganda, and he bought like 300 pieces of Soviet art and put it around his house, which I think is really cool. But he said he was buying it on eBay from Europe and Russia in like the early 2000s. And it was all of this art from these highly skilled, well-trained, fantastic portrait artists that would depict these great leaders and people, on these giant posters. And then it would have, Russian text, the big red, bold, these propagandic slogans. And he said he loves looking at those and watching the battle between art and propaganda, because the leaders of the Soviet Union would commission these trained artists to paint these masterpieces, portraits often, of real life individuals. But it was under the service of the state, and it was basically made as a idol to worship the boss, Stalin, Marx, Lenin. And so it's propaganda down to its core. But now that we're 50 years removed from that, he said the propaganda aspects of that art is sort of lost on people, and it's not it's failing in its mission to brainwash, sort of, or what's the purpose of propaganda? It's to manipulate people. That is fading away, and the artistic merit is bursting forth and overcoming. If this book was propaganda, and I'm not so sure that it was. The artistic merit of it today has won, without a doubt. It is so heart-wrenching. There's a quote from John Steinbeck when he finished this book, and he said, "I've done my darndest to rend the nerves of the reader to shreds." And he did a good job. It's harrowing, what these people have to go through. One of the people at the camp says, so I should have pulled up the quote, but it's like, "You don't know fear until you've watched your kids starve." You think you might be afraid of the police, you think you might be afraid of public speaking, or whatever it is that you're going through. Until you've watched your babies wither away with empty stomachs, and there's nothing you can do about it, you haven't experienced real fear. And that's every single family in this book. And it just gets to you. There is, I'm sure that Steinbeck was a liberal. I know Jordan Peterson has talked about his time in the Toronto socialist movement when he was a kid, when he was like 13. And he said there were some people that were in the Socialist Party that genuinely did want to help the poor. But he said most of them didn't love the poor, they just hated the rich. And that's the problem with these sort of ideologies like socialism, Marxism, communism, is that those people will win. And because resentment is a much more powerful and power-hungry attitude than compassion. But in this book, I see compassion. That's what I see. I don't see resentment. There is, obviously these characters get angry, especially the men. Pa Jode, it's an excellent representation of, he's a true patriarch. He's got kids that are like in their 30s, so he's been around for a long time. He loves his family. He's done everything that he can to provide for them, to take care of them. He is a good man. But you can sort of see his breakdown in this book. The more and more hardships that they go through, and the more that there's kind of this cascading of events like, oh, this is pretty bad, and then they get to California and they talk to some people that have been there that are turning back to go back to Oklahoma, which is, there's nothing for them back at Oklahoma, but they're going back. And you can see in Pa Jode, he's realizing just how helpless he is. And he's used to being in this role where he's protecting his family. He is a good father. That's what he does. But he's so impotent in these circumstances, and he withdraws into himself. And actually it's Ma Jode who arises as the leader. And I just felt so bad for the father in this book. And he ends up, he has a lot of resistance to his wife, and there's some interchange of dialogue between them where she starts giving orders, and he says something like, "This woman is asking for a slap." And, maybe to modern readers that's kind of horrible because, oh my gosh, like he's going to beat his wife. They did that back then. He's threatening to do that. But the way she responds, she's also a great character. It's not, and, maybe if you were really sensitive to like the crazy freaking stuff that these modern day feminists are spouting about, white man patriarchy, like just bashing down men, you might be sensitive to the fact that she becomes the leader and ends up ordering around her husband. Uh, you know, it's it's just sad. It's not that she's being wrong. It's not that he's being wrong. It's just it's sad that he's put in this position, that she's put in this position. She doesn't want to become the leader, but it's interesting that set up in this desperate environment of starvation and the man is no longer able to be the provider. It's the woman who rises up as the leader of the family. And she even tells him, when we get out of this, you can have at me. But until we do, I'm going to do what I can to take care of my family. She basically gives him permission to whoop her. But first, let's get out of this situation. And it's just survival. And it makes so much sense in the novel why the woman arises as the one to lead this family on through survival. It's kind of becomes her domain now, because the most important thing now becomes keeping the family together. And there's threat of fragmentation. People start dying. The young men go off to work and they're not really sure where they are. Maybe they won't come back. And she sort of turns into this strong mama bear. And it's really well done. It's very powerful. And I just feel bad for the characters. But it makes sense that that's what would realistically happen. The way he writes it is so, he does not betray the internal logic of the story, like we talked about with Dostoevsky and the Idiot. I think that Steinbeck is just a genius when it comes to portraying events as they would actually happen. That's sort of what makes this a great book, is that it's fiction, but it's true. Another interesting character is Rose of Sharon. And she is sort of described as kind of an energetic, mischievous, saucy girl. But she gets pregnant. And I've never really seen a representation of a woman who is on the verge of becoming a mother, and the mystery and the joy of that sort of miracle of life that is going on inside of her is really well portrayed with this character. And some critics say that it's done by stereotyping, because it says now that she's pregnant, she becomes more of a mysterious woman, and she'll kind of, there'll be a few instances in this book where she'll kind of put her hand on her belly and sort of look off into the distance and smile, contemplating the mystery of what's going on. And maybe it was a stereotype back in that day, but I think as a modern reader, you hear so little about what it's like to be a parent, what it's like to have kids. That's really been pushed down and put down in our society. And so that was a real pleasure for me to see that portrayed in that character. Because there's something very spiritual and religious about it. And she's almost a Virgin Mary figure, I guess you could say. She becomes sort of a revered figure because of her role as mother. Even though it has its elements of tragedy, she transcends that. And it's really beautifully written. And it's something that I was not as familiar with. I'm sure if you're more widely read, especially in older books or religious texts. I know that I grew up Protestant, and we really did away with the adoration of Mary. And what are these Catholics doing? Are they worshiping Mary? They're praying to Mary? That's not cool. There's only one God, and same with the Orthodox. Um, but, and, maybe some of those fears have based on some sort of foundation, although the more that I study about Orthodoxy and Catholicism, it's not so much that Mary is being worshipped. Um, but, and then getting into Jungian psychology, really, his idea is that the psyche has a natural desire to be balanced, whether that's masculine, feminine, whether that's good, evil, light, dark. And so, in doing away with the feminine aspect of the religion, being in the focus on Mary, Protestants have really gotten unbalanced in that way, which is not good because it will manifest in a twisted sort of compensation for that in the future. And, if you look at the state of Protestantism, especially with the more liberal denominations, it's definitely coming back, I think, in a way that might not be psychically healthy. That now we're getting into like women being leaders in the church and that sort of thing. And I think women from the very beginning of Christianity always had a very, very important role. It was just different than men. And now it's like the Protestants don't know what to do with women. Whereas, it's just like they're, okay, well, women should have a role, so maybe they should have the exact same role as men. Well, then it's just a masculine role with a woman replacing that. It's the same thing that Hollywood's doing, We're going to have more women superheroes, more women in the lead of an action role and that sort of thing. It's like, that's not a feminine character, though. That's a masculine character with a feminine face. There is, and this goes back to Jonathan Pageau, and I really recommend that you watch his videos on this symbolism of femininity. But one thing he said that really resonated with me is like, it's something that you can't really talk about because it is mysterious. And talking about it and identifying it and sort of putting a label on it so that you can categorize what is the feminine symbolism that isn't corrupt, then you're kind of taking away its power, because a lot of its power is through suggestion, is through mystery, is through, maybe it's because defining something and turning a symbolic symbol into words, imposing logos on something so that you can articulate and understand it, that act is a masculine endeavor. And so if you try and do that with the feminine, then it's not meant to be done. It's not supposed to be done. And I think Rose of Sharon really is a character that helped me understand this, because she is very mysterious. The thing, she does a lot and she is very important, but what it is that she does and why she's important is hard to look at the book and say, well, this is something that happened, that it's hard to put a label on. But she is incredibly important in this novel and an incredibly powerful character, at least to me, when reading this. Jim Casey is another character that I really, really liked. Where do I go from here? I kind of went on a big tangent about the symbolic feminism, and I'm probably going to get blasted in the comments for that, but that's okay. You know, I'm not, obviously I have a lot to learn, and maybe I got something wrong, but that's okay. I feel pretty strongly about that though, you know. Yeah, I like that character. So, here's what I would say in closing. You should read this book, especially if you only read it in high school. You should reread it. I read it in high school, didn't like it much, didn't hate it, but you know, a lot of people hated it. And all they would talk about was the final scene, you know, because that's what high schoolers are gonna latch on to. Oh my gosh, you got to read this. But now that I've matured, had a little bit of life experience, and I feel like I could really understand the idea of people just wanting dignity. It's not that they wanted money because they're looking for work, obviously, but they had to have it to be able to survive. And so it's not that they wanted survival, it's just that they wanted dignity. And what happened when these big corporations took over all of the agriculture, farming industry in the Great Depression, it's like, you've robbed us of our dignity because now we are just numbers. We used to have our own land. We used to be able, you know, it's not like we were rich, but I could feed my kids and I could go out and work the fields and give thanks to God for what he provided us with. Maybe it wasn't as much as we wanted, but you know, it's what the Lord provided, and I can rest easy knowing that I put in an honest day's work and I put food on the table for my family. And this is completely stripped from these characters. And I can really understand that now that I'm a little bit older. And it's not necessarily spelled out like that, although John Steinbeck is not really known for his subtlety. Whatever, subtlety can be overrated, I think. If you've got a good point, make it. And he did a phenomenal job on this book. I still liked East of Eden better. I think this is a better written book. I think it is his best book technically, but for me personally, I think East of Eden, I just have a special place in my heart for it. And it is also really well written. They're both masterpieces. And of Mice and Men, it's same story for that one. So, and I also listened to this one on Audible. So I've been cheating a lot. But the Audible version that I got was really well narrated. I don't know who the narrator is off the top of my head, but he did an amazing job. And I actually worked a lot doing sort of house projects, physical labor, carpentry type stuff while I was listening to this. So I think that added a lot to the impact that the themes had on me. These characters looking for work and honest, you know, blue collar type stuff. So yeah, very powerful. Thanks for listening to my spiel about The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck.